Welcome everyone. We'll just give it a few more seconds, minutes for people to join. All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. This is the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. I'm Didi Kuo, the Associate Director for Research at CDDRL, and I thank all of you for being here. So this is a talk that was supposed to happen last March, when Professor Davies was at Stanford, and we're glad that it's able to happen now. It had to get canceled when the pandemic struck. But today we're joined by Emeric Davies, an assistant professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a faculty associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and Center for International Development. He studies the political economy of education with a regional focus on South Asia. And today he'll be discussing new research on decentralization and education in Delhi. So if you have any questions during the course of his talk, please use the Q&A box function to send me your questions, and we'll be sure to leave plenty of time for discussion. All right, thanks so much, Emeric.
All right, thank you so much, Didi, and thank you all of you for being here. It's a real pleasure to present, especially a year after I was initially supposed to present. It was under not ideal circumstances that we had to postpone, and now I'm here with you today when Delhi, the city that I'm going to be talking about, is also under a new wave of lockdowns and going through record-breaking numbers of COVID cases. So it's with mixed emotions that I'm presenting this work that's also joint with two fabulous collaborators, Ashwini Deshpande, who's a professor of economics at Ashoka University, and Purusha, who initially started with us on the project as an RA, but has really become an intellectual thought partner for a lot of the work that you will see here today, and looking at the impact of implementing school boards on representation and intersegregation in Delhi. So by way of motivating my talk today, I want to start with some facts about the growth of cities and the importance of service provision in cities. So United Nations estimates that by 2050, about 70% of the world's population, or 7 billion people, will live in urban areas. And most of this will be in Africa and Asia. Delhi, where the work I'll be talking about today, the population of Delhi has doubled from about 10 million people to 20 million people in the last 30 years. So it's vitally important to understand how services are provided to the citizens of cities and urban areas as we move forward with this incredible growth of urban areas. And I want to show you how our traditional thinking about service provision in cities has gone in the academic literature, not just in South Asia and low and middle income countries, but I think in a lot of other places. I'm going to show you two pictures, and I'm going to highlight a couple of things. These are two pictures that we took from fieldwork, and this is one street in Delhi. You'll notice the street is not paved. And there's quite a bit of trash on the streets that remains uncollected. And if you have a keen eye, you also notice that most of the men are visibly Muslim and have indicators that they are Muslim, suggesting that this is a Muslim neighborhood within Delhi. I took this picture while we were going to survey one of the households in the survey that I'm going to talk about later. The next picture I'm going to show you was taken the very next day in a different neighborhood while we were going out to survey. If you notice, in contrast, the street is well paved. The little trash that there is here in a corner that's been swept up and ready to be picked up. If you have a keen eye, you can see the flag on this motorcycle is the flag of the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party that is in power at the federal level in India today. So quite a few contrasts between the two neighborhoods taken on two subsequent days in Delhi from households that we were going to survey for this project. So a lot of the work on urban areas in low and middle income countries has sort of taken this as the jumping off point, this inequality in service provision. Services are often provided to geographically segregated and homogeneous neighborhoods. Those two neighborhoods were in separate places and had relatively homogeneous populations in terms of income, education, wealth, caste, and religion within them. And they had shared goals over which to engage in collective action. It was very clear that one thing that citizens in one neighborhood would want to demand is paving a road, better sewage, and garbage collection. But the two households that we were going to survey in both those neighborhoods both sent their children to this same school. I'll point out very quickly, this is Purusha right here, one of the co-authors on this project. But both the households that we were going to survey sent their children to one school. So these diverse groups that are otherwise residentially segregated all come together in one place with potentially divergent views on how schools should be run and money in schools should be spent. So there's a tremendous diversity of citizens that come together in one space that doesn't happen in other urban areas. There's 1.5 million children that attend just over 1,000 government schools in Delhi. Assuming a two-parent household, this is about 1/4 of the city's population has some sort of connection to Delhi schools. This is probably one of the places where the most number of citizens come together in one space. On the other side, 25% of the government's budget is actually spent on education. Most of this expenditure is earmarked for teacher compensation and infrastructure. Today, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the rest of the budget for education that is not earmarked for teacher compensation and infrastructure. And the way I see it with representation in diverse spaces, there are a couple of questions for states. Given the diversity in the groups that come together in schools, how can states aggregate the interests to best represent a diverse population? So how can states aggregate the interests of parents to best represent a diverse population? And then a second question is, whose interests are best represented in these diverse spaces? So there are 3 ways of thinking about representation in these diverse spaces. The first one is descriptive. Representatives look like those that they are represented. James Mansbridge has a very famous essay on this, asking, should African Americans represent African Americans in the United States? And you could ask similar questions in Delhi. Who should represent the interests of Muslim parents from a Muslim neighborhood in schools? Who should represent the interests of upper caste parents from upper caste neighborhoods in schools? There's also substantive representation, where representatives represent the substantive and material interests of constituents. So it doesn't matter who the representative is, as long as they do a good job internalizing the preferences of their constituents and then raising those interests to the powers that be and extracting what the constituents want from the state. And then finally, there's the idea of trusteeship, where representatives act as guardians of the best interests of those that they represent. Citizens might have some preferences, but representatives have more information on what actually needs to get done. So going back to the example of that picture of that neighborhood I showed you, with the unpaved roads and the uncollected trash, citizens might have a preference for one thing, and representatives might have better information both on how budgets can be spent and what they should be spent on. So representatives act as trustees to constituents. So we're going to study representation in the context of high schools in Delhi. And we're going to study this specifically with school management committees, which are constitutionally mandated bodies of 12 parents, 2 teachers, and 2 members of the community who are designed to represent the interests of parents within schools, as well as construct plans for the spending of the discretionary portion of the budget that schools have access to. And the government of Delhi implemented 2 reforms to try and empower these school management committees. So the top bullet point you see is just what is mandated by the law, and then the government of Delhi went above and beyond this. First, they mandated elections to select parental representatives, with the idea that electing representatives to school management committees would lead to better forms of representation. The government of Delhi wasn't explicitly thinking in terms of substantive versus descriptive versus trusteeship representation. They just said that elections would do a better job of selecting parental representatives. And then in 2018, they increased the discretionary budgets of schools from 300,000 rupees per year, about $4,000, to 500,000 so between 500,000 to 700,000 rupees, $7,000 to $10,000, depending on the size of the school. And then SMCs, these bodies of 12 parents who are now being elected, 2 teachers and 2 members of the community, had to decide how to spend this money every school year. I should say at the outset, and part of the work that we're going to be showing you, and part of the results that we're going to be showing you, I should say that compliance on electing parents was imperfect. Some schools just chose not to hold elections, and I'm going to show you some results around that and differences between schools that chose to hold elections versus schools that did not hold elections. To give you a sense of what this looks like, this is an SMC meeting that we attended with the teacher at the front leading the meeting and parents sitting around a table, and this is a debate on what they were going to, how they were going to put together a school development plan for that year, how they're going to spend money from their discretionary budget for that year. And then SMC members are also, they attempt to make them highly visible. They post these boards around the schools, and this is on the outside of the wall of the school, with all the names of all the SMC members and their phone numbers, so that parents can reach out to these people if they have any issues at school. Okay. To preview some conclusions of what we find, we're going to find that representatives are not descriptively representative on either traditional markers of hierarchy, religion, and caste, or newer markers of hierarchy, class, or education. We find that representatives are intermediaries between parents and teachers. They are wealthier, they are better educated, and they are often of higher status than the parental body as a whole, even though they come from the parental body. So it is wealthier parents, it's better educated parents, and parents that come from higher in the class hierarchy who are serving as SMC members. And this is particularly pronounced in schools in which parents get to elect who represents them. But descriptive representation does not actually reflect preferences of parents, suggesting some form of Burkean or trusteeship representation. That SMC members, once they become SMC members, sort of have different sense of how budgets should be spent than what parents want. And we're going to do this in several ways. So we find first, parents state preferences for and then elect representatives that are higher status than them, so some form of trusteeship. Appointed representatives, these in schools that did not hold elections, are more representative, more descriptively representative, and more substantively representative than elected parents. And elected representatives seem to come closer to matching substantive precedents of parents and appointed representatives. Sorry, apologies. There's a discrepancy between bullet point 2 and bullet point 3. Appointed representatives are more descriptively representative, and elected representatives are more substantively representatives. And then the largest gaps in substantive representation are along lines of education and wealth rather than caste or religion. And competitive selection actually heightens the wealth gap. So to say this another way, the richer and better educated a representative is, the more different their preferences for how budgets should be spent are from parents. And competitive selection actually heightens the wealth gap. So elections heighten the difference between constituents and their representatives. I'm going to get into all of these in just a second. So for those of you who know Delhi, what we did is we sampled 50 out of the 1,000 schools, and the green and red dots represent the schools that we sampled. We try to ensure diversity of representation of schools across the entire city. The red dots are schools in which elections were held, and the green dots are schools in which elections were not held. And again, elections were not held in some schools because either they didn't have sufficient candidates in which to hold competitive elections, or the school headmaster chose not to hold elections. So I'm not going to make the claim that these schools are exactly comparable, but there are some interesting differences both in the pool of candidates that are in SMCs and what happens as a result that I'll talk about in just a second. Data collection for this project, what we did is we surveyed a random sample of 30 parents across each of these 50 schools. In an attempt to be representative of the interests of the school body as a whole, of the parent body as a whole. And then we surveyed all of the SMC members, so all 12 parents, the 2 teachers, and the 2 members of the community who are appointed to the school boards. And we also, for the schools that held elections, we surveyed everybody that ran but did not win elections in those school boards. This is about another 500 people across, 600 people across the 50 schools. And then we have detailed administrative data on how budgets were spent. So in these 2 surveys, we asked parents and representatives how they would want discretionary budgets to be spent. And then we have administrative data on how budgets were actually spent. So we can match what parents, representatives say they want and differences between the 2, and then look at who actually gets what they want on the budget. So first, I'm going to dive into demand for representatives. In the first part of the survey, in the household survey, we asked parents, who would you want to represent? And what we did is we used a conjoint experiment and presented parents with 2 fictional candidates standing in an election, and asked them, who are you most likely to vote for to represent you on the SMC? And in these 2 fictional candidates, we varied randomly across all the parents we surveyed, the gender of the candidate, the caste of the candidate, the religion of the candidates, the level of education of the candidates, the political party affiliation, and the distance the individual lives from the school. This final one, to get at preferences for somebody who would have sort of lower opportunity cost to be more involved in schools. So to show you results from this very quickly, so this represents how the probability that a parent would pick a candidate with this characteristic. And a couple of results stand out. Parents suggest that they would much rather women represent them on school boards. And in follow-up qualitative interviews that we were conducting just as the pandemic hit and cut fieldwork short, a lot of this is driven by beliefs that education is the mother's domain, and women better understand what is going on in the lives of their children as far as schools are concerned, and therefore the representatives should also be women because they better understand the issues going on in schools. The biggest driver of preferences for school board members is level of education. So a university grad is preferred to somebody who has a high school education, who is preferred to somebody who has a primary school education, who is preferred to somebody who has no education. And this is the strongest predictor of who parents would prefer to have them represent them. In terms of caste, we find no effects of caste on demands for representatives. In fact, this is actually the most contentious part, more contentious than political party affiliation, as these are supposed to be non-partisan school board elections. Caste is actually the most contentious part. And parents would often ask us, why are you asking us about caste? Caste does not matter as long as we have somebody who can get the job done within the school board. But at the same time, religion, we find that parents express preferences, lower preferences for Muslim representatives than Hindu representatives. And then in terms of whether the representative is from Delhi or not, representatives that are from Delhi are much preferred to migrants. And then just getting at the opportunity cost, this is unsurprising. People who live close to the school are much preferred to people who live further away from the school. So to sum that up, there's a strong preference for women. There's a strong preference for people with high levels of education. And there's some level of discrimination against Muslims. And the schools, the parental body of the schools is actually broadly representative of the total population of Muslims in Delhi, which is about 20% of the population of Delhi are Muslim, but strong preference against Muslim representatives on school boards. Turning to descriptive representation, now we can actually look at who got elected and who serves relative to the parent body. So do they look like each other? The short answer is no, but let me show this to you empirically. We're going to compare characteristics of all the groups in our sample. For those in the audience who prefer the formal notation, what we're going to do is look at the characteristic of the representative of the proportion of people that share a characteristic compared on gender, years of education, number of household assets as a measure of wealth, caste, and religion, between SMC members, teachers, and party workers, which are the appointed representatives from the community. So we're just going to call them party workers from now on because they are effectively nominated by the governing party to serve on these boards, and they weren't just any random member of the community. Show this empirically, and I'll walk you through this table. There are a lot of numbers here, but I'll walk you through this table. Column 1 is the probability that each of these groups of representatives was male. This is the years of education, the number of assets on 18 common household assets, the probability that a representative is either a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe, official government designations for a caste in India that have been discriminated against. OBC is other backward castes, upper caste, and then Muslim. And then the parent mean, 0.34 means that 34% of our respondents were women. We asked parents to let us survey the person most involved. 34% of our respondents were male. We asked the parents to let us survey the person most responsible for their child's education. And this, in 66% of the cases, was the mother. Then we asked for years of education. Parents have about a primary school education. The number of assets in the household, about 8. The percentage of SC and ST households, about 30, 33% OBC, 36% upper caste, and about 20% Muslim. As I mentioned, is about the Delhi mean. And then here, what we see is that elected parents are much better educated, have about 1 more asset, and are about 5% less likely to be SC or ST, 6% more likely to be upper caste, and 5% less likely to be Muslim, as opposed to the appointed representatives, who are better educated, but not as well educated as those that were elected, and wealthier, but not as wealthy as those that were elected. So do they look like, do representatives look like those they represent? They're more educated, they're wealthier, and they're no different along caste lines. They're higher status on some caste lines, but mostly no different, not as different as teachers, and less likely to be Muslim than parents. So school parents seem to mostly be getting what they want in terms of representation. They want people who are higher status than them, and that's what they get when they select those people. Next, we're going to measure budgetary preferences. We're going to ask all parents and representatives. We would now like to see how this SMC spends SMC funds. We will present you with these pictures indicating broad areas under which you could spend the SMC fund, and 20 tokens, each representing 25,000 rupees. So in total, 500,000 rupees. But please use all the tokens according to your priorities by putting them on the pictures lying in front of you. Asking parents and representatives to sort of mimic the process of setting the budget and spending the budget. And there's a constraint in that you have 20 tokens and you have to divide this amongst what you can spend money on. And we would place these cards in front of them just so you see what these look like. This would be for spending money on additional teachers. And this would be for spending money on water. For those of you that can speak Hindi or are familiar with water filters in India, this says water in Hindi, and this is a cartoon representation of a water filter that can be bought for schools. And they could spend money on 6 categories: health and sanitation, infrastructure, security, teaching and learning materials, new teachers, and extracurricular activities. So the water filter would be health and sanitation, and the teacher would be new teachers. And then we're just going to look at differences between what parents and representatives want. And to move very quickly through this, the biggest differences is that elected parents and appointed parents want to spend far less on health and sanitation than constituents and parents. And appointed parents also want to spend less on security, but more on teaching and learning, while elected parents want to spend less on extracurricular activities across the 6 categories that they could spend the budget on. So appointed parents have greater differences than elected parents across a broader range of categories than elected parents. But this isn't so much what we care about. What we care about is actually how this money gets spent. And we also care about the individual level differences between representatives and their constituents. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to construct agreement scores between what the parent wants and what their elected representative wants, and take the difference between these 2 scores, and then look at what is driving these differences, whether it's caste, whether it's religion, wealth, or education. And we're going to measure agreement between parents and SMC members, and we're going to construct 21,000 parent SMC member dyad. So in each school, we have 12 SMC members, and we have 30 parents. So we construct agreement scores between each one of these people to see the difference between the representative and the parent. And I'm going to be showing a couple of these facet plots in a second, but to walk you through this, this is for each of the budget categories: health and sanitation, infrastructure, security, teaching and learning, teachers, extracurriculars, and then the total deviation between the parent and the representative. And then this is the effect of having a representative that is the same caste as you, having a representative of the same religion as you, having a representative that's the same, having the difference between the level of wealth between the representative and the parent, and the difference between the level of education of the representative and the parent. And the biggest driver of deviation between parents and representatives is wealth. We didn't ask income because it's very hard for parents, especially in the informal economy, to sort of talk about inconsistent income. So we just asked about assets. The biggest driver is wealth. Wealthier representatives have preferences that are far different to those of their constituents. There is some effective education, but none of it as big as wealth. And this is shown most in preferences for teaching and learning materials and health and sanitation. So going back to the original, just raw amounts that they want spent, parents want far more spent on health and sanitation. Richer parents want far less spent on health and sanitation. And richer representatives want far less, and richer representatives want far more spent on teaching and learning materials. And then moving to what actually gets spent. So this is just looking at the differences between those two groups. Now we're going to match parents to, now we're going to match S&C members to what actually gets spent on the budget. So we collected individual level bills from 900 schools and matched this to official ministry data on expenditure for the 2 years in which we were in the field, and then matched that to the preferences of S&C members. So who gets what they want is essentially what we're doing here. We're going to do, and then we're going to code each of these bills into the 6 budget categories that I showed you earlier. So again, a similar facet plot, but this time looking at the differences between elected, not elected, appointed, teachers, and party workers. And a negative point estimate here means that there is a smaller difference in between what share of the budget was spent on that item and what share of the budget was the representative wanted spent on that item. So the 2 groups of people within SMCs that have their preferences most closely met are elected parents and teachers. So there is, by electing parents, there's some shift away to the preferences of parents rather than teachers relative to appointed parents who do not see a shift towards them. But there is a greater shift for teachers and elected parents. So who gets what they want? Elected parents and teachers are most likely to have their preferences most closely fulfilled. And this is driven by closer preferences on expenditure on health, and for teachers, infrastructure, security, and additional teachers. So teachers universally want fewer new teachers in the school, and universally want higher levels of better infrastructure and more spending on infrastructure. So I want to make a quick point about service provision in cities again, especially around education. So returning to the picture I took when we went to a school in Delhi, this is a really nice school. And it was recently built about 2 years before we were in the field. This is in comparison to a school I took from a previous round of fieldwork in Uttar Pradesh, in a rural area of India. So part of what is going on with service provision in cities is it's a difference in kind in the types of service provision. The conflicts going on in this school, where the infrastructure is relatively well developed and the basic needs of the school are taken care of relative to this school, means that the conflicts and diversities of opinions are on a different set of items than they would be here. When this picture was taken, you can see the children standing outside a locked door because the teacher had not arrived for work, and this was taken at around midday. So the demands of parents in this school are far different from the demands of parents in schools in urban areas. Okay, so to begin wrapping this up, what form of representation dominates? Back to the original question. Constituents are not descriptively represented by their representatives on either traditional hierarchical markers, religion and caste, or new markers of hierarchy, education and wealth. Elected representatives come somewhat closer to matching the preferences of parents than appointed representatives. And appointed representatives come closer to matching the preferences of teachers than elected representatives. This is perhaps unsurprising. When you let the wolves into the hen house, they're going to appoint people that allow them to continue perpetuating their power. But the largest differences in what parents want and what representatives get is driven by new markers of hierarchy, education, and wealth. So better educated and wealthier representatives are more likely to get what they want, and what they want is also different to what parents want. And there's some electoral constraints for the policymaker and the government to think about here. Elections have resulted in both elite capture along descriptive lines. Elections lead to better educated, wealthier parents being elected, but this is actually what parents want. But it also leads to better substantive representation. So depending on what the policymaker wants, do you want elites within the parent body to sit on SMC boards, wealthier, better educated, and higher on caste hierarchies, and less representative in terms of religion? Or do you want to shift preferences away from bureaucrats in the form of teachers and closer to parents? And this is with a recognition that representatives also have preferences of their own that might be different from teachers and might be different from the parents that they are supposed to and elected to represent. So I'm going to stop there and thank you for coming. I know that this has been a long year, and a lot of us have Zoom fatigue, but thank you. And I look forward to your questions and conversation from us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Emmerich. And it's hard to have Zoom fatigue when this research is so fascinating. We had just been discussing before opening the webinar that Emmerich and I are both in California, where there have been a lot of political skirmishes between parents and teachers on local education decisions. So this is really timely and really interesting. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A, but I'll kick us off by asking, what was the motivation behind these reforms in general? And is this a part, the creation of the SMCs? And was this part of any kind of either national in India or international trend towards decentralization of education decisions?
Yeah, no, so the motivation for these reforms in general, it's a really interesting process that I could spend hours talking about. And I've spent a lot of time with the party that actually implemented these reforms. And I was telling Didi about this a little bit more, and anybody who knows the recent political history in Delhi, the party that came to power in 2015 and implemented these reforms came to power on an anti-corruption platform, but also a platform of deepening citizen democracy. So they implemented a number of reforms, not only in education, but in health service provision, and a number of other services that decentralized power to local bodies. And the idea was that citizens across a range of services would have greater say in service provision. Unfortunately, education was the only one that stuck. They were legally taken to court by the central government, saying that they didn't have the mandate to implement these other reforms, and this was the only one that stuck in terms of their decentralized force. But there was an ideological and partisan commitment on behalf of the party that came to power to deepen decentralization within Delhi across a broad range of services, education just being one of them.
Okay. There's a question here from Eric Jensen at CDDRL asking, even though it's not part of your research design, did you observe any differences in the performance of elected committees or appointed committees? And what were the outcomes that resulted, if that's something that you could measure even just observationally on these different types of SMCs?
Yeah, no, so great question. I don't know if this is exactly getting at what you want, but one other thing that we did do that we haven't had a chance to code up yet because it's just taken a huge amount of time is we actually we filmed a random sample of these meetings in the 50 schools that we went to, and saw who was most likely to speak up in meetings and what they were likely to speak up about. And we're in the middle of coding this, and we've had to hire a team of RAs that we were able to do when lockdown lifted briefly in Delhi, to hire a team of RAs to start coding this. Unfortunately, we haven't had the time to do this fully. I don't know if that's so much performance as much as functioning. And then the biggest budgetary expenditure from these budgets is actually infrastructure. And it just seems like there's a lot of infrastructural concerns on behalf of the parents, on behalf of the representatives, on behalf of the schools. So some of the budget just needs to go to infrastructure itself, and they do divert funds towards infrastructure. I haven't actually looked at whether elected versus appointed bodies do a better job of sort of diverting funds towards infrastructure, but that was sort of the biggest source of expenditure.
Okay, so there's a question from Marcel Fafchamp, a senior fellow here, asking if the preference for electing a Hindu representative may vary by the religion of the parent. If Muslim parents prefer Muslim representatives, is that a dynamic that you found to be the case? Maybe believing that there are some more parallels between their interests and the interests of someone with a similar religious background. And there's a similar question asking if there's segregation within the schools on religious grounds to begin with.
Yeah, so one conjoint that I didn't actually show that I should have showed is, instead of just sort of looking at the absolute characteristics of the parent and looking at whether a parent would choose a representative from a Muslim or a Hindu background, is just actually coding it on whether they shared that characteristic with the parent. And surprisingly, that point estimate is 0. There isn't any stronger preference for a representative that shares your religion or shares your caste background. So there isn't any outwardly expressed preference for Muslims having Muslim representatives and Hindus having Hindu representatives. As far as segregation within schools is concerned, unfortunately, we don't have sufficient data to sort of say whether schools are segregated, because we don't have details on all the parents within schools. The government itself does not and cannot collect data on the religion of their of the parents in the school. So all the data that you saw on religion on caste was collected by us, because they just don't want to and cannot ask those questions. So we unfortunately can't tell school level segregation. What we can see is, amongst the people that we did survey, there is some clustering in schools. So although schools are more diverse than neighborhoods might be, schools that have more Muslim parents, there are schools that sort of have a greater share of Muslim parents that we serve.
Okay. So a question from Dinsha Mistry here at Stanford is asking about generalizability. So how do your findings maybe speak to more general election preferences in India? Maybe voters in traditional elections have similar preferences about who represents them, not just on school boards, but more broadly. And also, how does what you're observing in Delhi vary with what you would see at PTAs in the United States, like anytime there's parental involvement in education?
No, so with respect to election preferences in India more broadly, I actually think about what we're seeing here not so much in terms of sort of election for higher office, but an increasing amount of work on urban brokerage and how citizens in urban areas in India have their interests met and make demands on the state through local level brokers. And I think that is actually the closer parallel. And this is a lot of work done by Adam Auerbach and Tarek Dacho and Gabby Crooks-Wisner on this, in which there's actually a lot of similarity between sort of the conjoint that I shared and some of the work that they've done. The biggest demand there is people who can get things done for citizens, and it's not so much whether they are descriptively representative or they share any characteristics. It's somebody that they know that they can go to, and when they go to that person, they will get something done. So if they want a water connection or electricity connection in their neighborhood, if they want trash picked up, they will go to the person that has a track record of getting things done, irrespective of who they are. So I think this sort of speaks a little bit to that line of work, in that parents also seem to see SMC representatives as people that can get things done, and what they're most interested, at least stated what they're most interested in, is having people who can get things done. And this is sort of represented both by people that live close to the school and by people who have high levels of education, so who can bridge the gap between parents and teachers in terms of their levels of representation. In terms of PTAs in the United States, I would point you to some excellent work actually being done on very, very similar questions by a team out of Ohio State, led by the political science department at Ohio State, led by Vladimir Kogan and Stefan Levertu, looking at representation in school boards and PTAs in the United States. And again, they find very, very similar things, that the school board members and the PTA members look nothing like the parents that they're designed to represent in school boards and PTAs. Because it's not a requirement, at least for the school board, to have in a lot of places to have a child in the school system. There's actually a funny example from Cambridge this past school board election, where one of the people running was a 19-year-old who was a product of Cambridge public schools, but had no children in the public school system. So they look nothing like the parents that send their children to school. They're wealthier. They're wider than the parents that send their kids to schools, and this is across a number of school boards that Vlad Kogan and Stefan Levertu are studying, and also find differences in the demands that school boards make versus the demands that the parents make. But I shouldn't speak on their behalf. I would encourage you to look up Vlad Kogan and Stefan Levertu's work. So in terms of generalizability, I think a very similar finding between both our work is that when you open these spaces up to competitive pressures in the forms of elections, what you see is elites take advantage of this and get themselves elected onto these boards to be able to sort of drive the agenda.
Okay, so I have a question combining, I suppose, some comments you just made about urban brokerage with another question here about political preferences in the parents and whether or not this correlated with expectations for who gets elected or what SMCs do. Typically in urban environments, I mean, an across the board finding consistently in democracies is that higher socioeconomic status voters are better able to get what they want from government, including public goods, and often in the form of club goods for themselves. But in urban areas where you have strong machine parties, you are sometimes better able to redistribute because of client-patron relationships between political parties and maybe less advantaged voters. So in a dynamic like this, which was explicitly designed to break patterns of corruption and patronage, you still find, you find that you revert to a more typical political dynamic whereby wealthier and elite parents or voters are able to get what they want. So how do you, how did political preferences, I saw that it wasn't a consistent finding in significantly in some of your quantitative work, but how did politics play into this? And how have the mainstream larger parties in India responded to some of these dynamics?
Yeah, so I'm gonna step outside my researcher shoes for just a second, and talk about the sort of larger political economy of Delhi, if you don't mind. So I mean, I think that observation is exactly right. That a large part of the support base for opposition parties in Delhi. So the party that they implemented these reforms is sort of an anti-corruption insurgent new party. And the two traditional parties, the BJP and the Congress, the support base for the Congress rested in middle-class welfare societies organized around neighborhoods. And the support base for the BJP, at least in Delhi, rested around religious organizations within the city. This new insurgent party doesn't have traditionally organized constituency base, even though they won elections. It was sort of unorganized support beyond just the electoral arena. So part of what they are trying to do is create this new organized political machine that doesn't rest in middle-class neighborhoods and doesn't rest around Hindu religious groups. And this they saw as one way of doing that, both by decentralizing power. They'd also sort of be able to consolidate power, both through goodwill, but also through creating large numbers of representatives that sort of sat between parents and the school that would then sort of serve as a more organized support base in the future. How well that's worked, I don't know. They haven't faced any state level elections since then, so we are yet to. Oh, sorry, I misspoke. They did face a state level election and they won again, but lost some seats. So sort of how well that has worked is unclear.
Okay, so there's a question from one of our postdocs, Nate Grubman, saying that it reminds him, your research, a little bit of research on union democracy, like by Lipset, Levy, and Ahlquist. So are parents aware of these gaps in representation? You've indicated that they don't really mind that they're electing people who are different from them. Are there different democratic procedures in place or under discussion besides election, like something more like participatory budgeting or referenda, for example?
Yeah, so the first question, are parents aware of these gaps in representation? Unfortunately, I'm not sure. Okay. We would have loved to do a follow-up when and gone back to parents and said, look, this is what you said you wanted, and this is what your representatives said you wanted. We finished fieldwork in January 2020, and then the world happened. Right. So we haven't been able to go back and see if parents are aware. And we didn't know that we would be finding gaps this big. Right. Sorry, I forgot the second part of the question there.
If there's more participatory type of governance.
Yeah. That's another great one. So there were plans to hold district-wide. So there are 13 education districts in Delhi. There are plans to hold district-wide meetings where all parents were invited, not just SMC members, but SMC members would lead these meetings in discussions over how budgets should be spent. I guess it's not quite participatory budgeting in that SMC members would still have the final say on how these would go. And after sort of a tremendous flurry of activity, and I attended 2 of these, I think they held 6 across the city. They eventually stopped holding them for a number of reasons. They were logistically incredibly difficult to hold. They weren't particularly well attended. And so there was discussion about doing this, but institutionalizing this on top of other reforms that they were implementing, I think became both logistically too difficult and politically, they didn't want to expend political capital on doing this.
Okay, so cool question from a postdoc, Leah Rosenzweig, about performance again, but this time of schools. So first of all, is there a potential relationship already between richer areas having better schools than poorer areas? And those kinds of inequities, with wealthier parents now representing what the school interests are and what the school budget goes to, do we find that performance is improved for wealthier students or students in wealthy areas at a higher rate than students in less wealthy areas?
Yeah, no, so a couple of things here. First, we should have, and this is a missed opportunity. We didn't test students on learning. This is a huge regret from the project, and there isn't very good independent data on learning. So when you said performance, I immediately sort of jumped to learning, which I think is a decent metric of performance. So we don't have a great baseline or measure of learning if you sort of see learning as good performance. In terms of things like infrastructure, so yes, there's certainly huge diversity in the quality of infrastructure between schools at the center of Delhi. For those of you who have been to Delhi, South Delhi, which is the wealthy part of Delhi, and the outskirts of Delhi as you start pushing out towards the edges of the city, huge gaps in the quality of infrastructure. One of the things that the government has been trying to do is sort of equalize those differences. So I guess I guess the central question is, do schools that are represented by wealthier parents have better or worse performance outcomes than others? And is performance otherwise equally distributed across richer and poorer students? So in terms of infrastructure, just visibly, and in terms of just measuring where better or worse infrastructure is, yes, schools that are represented by wealthier parents do have better performance, but there's a couple of things going on here that complicate this. Where wealthier parents live is also the older, more settled neighborhoods of Delhi. Where poorer parents live are migrant neighborhoods of Delhi, where schools are only more recently being built. So at the time we were in the field, I believe the government built about 100 schools in the 3 years that we were in the field. So recognition that both the population was growing and was moving to areas that were very, very different. So that's a tentative yes to the question, that schools that are represented by wealthier parents have better performance, at least on sort of the quality of school infrastructure.
Okay. Well, we'll use this final few minutes to ask a question that you were just saying you're thinking about the normative conclusions of this study. And a question from one of our postdocs, Salma Musa, is if parents don't want to elect representatives who look like them, what does it mean for whether or not descriptive representation is desirable in this setting?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'm not the social planner here, so I don't think that it is my responsibility to answer that on a policy level. I will say that one part of the official mandate that came out from the government and the Ministry of Education when they implemented these reforms was that they should please ensure that the school management committees were representative of the larger parent body. What that meant was left to individual schools and individual headmasters to decide. In practice, what that ended up meaning was that in schools in which elections were held, there was a tremendous number of women that ran because they wanted to be represented across lines of gender, and a fairly good number, overrepresented number of lower caste parents running. So there was an explicit goal, although not well defined by the government, to make sure that these bodies were descriptively representative. And then there's a question of whether those descriptively representative bodies are actually better at substantive representation. And that's where I sort of, I pause and punt, and I'm not quite sure what to think about whether they, it is okay that these mandates were followed to a point, but then that doesn't actually matter.
Right. All right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, although I have many more questions for you about education and preferences, but this is really fascinating work. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our audience for your wonderful questions.
Yeah, no, thank you all of you for joining.
All right. Bye, Emmerich.
Bye.